Welcome to another episode of Mission RV Services. Today, yesterday we replaced a trim rail cover on a cargo door. But today we're going to replace a trim rail cover on across the top above an awning that goes from the front of the camper to the back. So what the trim rail does is that's where the roof seams against the sidewall, and when those two materials meet, they join and they put a trim rail on there. So that trim rail behind it is usually made out of aluminum or some kind of a metal. Very rarely have I seen them plastic. To be honest, I can't even remember. I know they make them, but I don't remember the last time I saw plastic. But generally they're aluminum. This is a 7/8 trim rail cover, which is probably the most standard size. There are a couple other sizes out there for special applications, but generally they are this 7/8 material. So this cover, when you screw in the trim rail, there's butyl tape behind the trim rail and you screw it in. And then that is what creates the bond or the seal between the roof line and the sidewall, but it also helps keep water out. And what this does is it covers those screws up, and it's just an added barrier for protection to try to keep water from getting behind the screw heads. So the one we're going to do today is pretty rough. It's cracking, broken, falling out. So we're going to replace it with this. At the end, once we get it, either if it requires screws, we'll screw it back in on the ends, and then we'll put a little bit of RTV black sealant on there to match the trim rail cover. We may need a brush to brush out the track if it's really dirty. Sometimes you may need a plastic scraper just to pop the trim rail cover in, but generally we can squeeze it and we can get that applied in there, and it just really not a very tough job. Just takes a little bit of patience and getting the old one out, but you do have to work on a ladder. If you're not comfortable with that, make sure you get a qualified RV technician to do that for you. You can find one of them at the rvtaa.org in an area next to you, no matter where you're at. There's always somebody close. And other than that, and microfiber just to wipe things down as we go. So we're going to take you along. Come on this way. For those of you that wear Crocs, make sure you got them in four-wheel drive. Another thing you could use on this is a razor knife if you need to, because we have a screw right there. Hopefully you can see it on the camera. It's a number 2 square head. So we're gonna get into that, take this out. And then at the end we'll reseal this up. Leave our screw right there, but as you can see, this is falling apart. So we're gonna pull this right out. It's already out over here, as you can see. So one thing we can do here, because it is out down there, is the whole thing, as you can see, just split right in half. It was already split in half, but we can throw that over the side, and now since the whole thing just came out for us, we can just start putting the new one right in. Now it's a little bit of a challenge we'll have is getting behind our ladder here, but again, like I said, it's one of those things. We're just going to use some patience while we do this, and seam this behind here. But all right, so we're going to get down and have to adjust our ladder just a little bit. So we are going to work behind our ladder a little bit here, but what we're going to do is we're going to get this started here, and once we get that in there, I'm going to go ahead and push that right into the end. And then, like I said, it's just patience. You're going to sit here, you're going to put it in one side of the track, and then you're just going to pinch this thing all the way down. Figure out which way you feel most comfortable pinching it, and then if you run into any issues, then you just address them as you go. But once you get started, it's always good to use this too if it's a little bit warm. So You could use a heat gun, but you got to be very careful with your heat gun settings. You don't want to deform it. You want to make sure that you're doing a good job with it and not overheating it. If you overheat it, it's going to be harder to work with. If it's too cold, it's hard to work with. So you definitely have to be somewhat careful with it. But what we're going to do is we're going to get this in as far as we can. Now when I move the ladder over, I'm going to have to probably adjust under the ladder where I can't really see, and I know it's hard for you guys to see as well, but we'll come back to it and we'll get it in there. But actually I think we got it in there. Good. So we just keep moving along, and like I said, this is a one of those things that if you're okay with heights, and there's not a lot to mess up on it, but if you don't get it seated in the track correctly, you could definitely run into some problems down the road, because you'll get water behind there that could get behind your screw heads. And so it's one of those things, if you're not comfortable with heights or working on ladders, then you probably want to get somebody else to do this for you. If you are just not comfortable thinking you can get this tucked into the track correctly, if you don't have patience, that's a good one. You definitely want to have patience with this, because it's you know, you're gonna have to get down, you're gonna have to move your ladder. I do know some people that do this off the roof. They'll just kneel down the roof line and do it. You know, that's not how we do it. I just don't feel like kneeling over from the roof and hanging over the edge and trying to get this in. So for me, it's not a super long job, so I'm just gonna go do it as far over as I can. Then I'm gonna make an adjustment on my ladder and then just keep on going down. So now over here we're gonna have an awning that we have to lean the ladder against. So I'm gonna focus here for 1 second on our pool noodles, right? So these pool noodles, they do a couple things. They keep the edge of my ladder off of this trim rail, this gutter line. It also protects the edge of the roof. So I'm going to make an adjustment on this, so when I'm leaning up here against this tube, I'm going to have my ladder straighter. So this is where being comfortable on ladders is going to come into play. If you're not comfortable on your ladder, you definitely don't want to lean against an awning tube, because we're going to try to decrease as much pressure as possible as we lean on that, as we continue down the line with our trim rail cover. Okay, so we're going to stop at this point. So before we move our ladder, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead, we made a mark where our screw goes in. We are going to put our screw into here. We're going to complete this end before we move down the rest of the trim rail, because when we get to the other end, we're going to screw that side in. So here we're going to go ahead and we know our screw hole is right about here. Pop this cover back in there on the top and the bottom. Just pulled out a little bit with my screw there. Put my thumb there to hold it in place. And now I'm going to screw that in. So what we're doing here is we're screwing this in for a couple reasons. Is sometimes I see manufacturers that don't do this, but we are screwing this in here so once we get the other side in too, if this tends to shrink, which it will in the sun, it's going to hold in place. It's not going to shrink up and pull away and expose that trim rail. So now we were going to grab our rag here, and we're going to grab our RTV. And the reason we're using the RTV is because, well, it's black and it matches. So we're just going to put that on there, cover that screw hole up, and just really fill that in right there without making a big mess. And we're just going to fill in our areas and get a good seal there. Hopefully you guys can see that on camera and it translates. But so what we did is we put a little bit over the screw head, we sealed up that end, and actually I see we could probably use just a little bit more there on the end, but now that whole thing is sealed up really good. And then we're just going to take our screwdriver, our rag, and our RTV, and we'll take it down to the other end with us. I can get about 6 feet at a time moving the ladder. So based on arm length. And all we're doing here is just watch as we're tucking the bottom in and pushing the top. So we've got the sun's up here, which is really helping. So as I'm doing this, I'm stretching that out and letting my next section kind of sit in the sun. So as I bake, it bakes too. And we just keep on trucking. And I apologize for the ladder getting in your field of vision, but if I know Jen, she'll probably speed some of this up. And because I don't think you need to see me do the same thing over and over for 35 feet, but you definitely need to see how we're doing it. And our biggest concern as always is how it translates when we have the sunlight blocking your field of vision in the camera. But always look, just make sure everything is seated as you go. Like I said, this isn't a race, it's all about patience. So you definitely want to take your time. Okay, so we're at a point right now, and this is, so since we're working on this trim rail cover, you can kind of see what the trim rail cover does. So here's where the roof meets the sidewall. This cover, basically the end of this material is under there. The sidewall is right below that. But as it comes down, right here we see a seam. So this seam is still sealed relatively well. So, but this is a good time when you're doing your trim rail cover, you can take a look at your seams, and if you need to do any kind of RTV or silicone repair right here, this is a good opportunity to do that. But you get a good idea of the screw holes. The butyl tape is behind that, and it's holding this material in place for your roof. So that is what the trim rail cover does, and this goes over to keep water from getting behind these screw heads. So that's why this trim rail cover is so important. So when you see these going bad on your rig, jump on top of that. You need to get them replaced. Don't let them go, don't let them crack, don't let them split in half. So here at that seam, so hopefully you can see it. Jen's getting a shot of it too. You'll see a little divot. So what I'm going to have Jen do is just take a little dab on her finger and push it right on top of that little divot, just as an added thing of protection. And we're just going to go right on top of the divot on the plastic, and that's it. And it's just not that the water is going to get in there, but where the seam is, it just is it's an area where you could get potential water intrusion under there. So a little drop of our RTV silicone is going to go a long way to help us protect that seam and protect those screw heads from water intrusion. You know, just taking your time and taking the patience to do this and getting this renewed reminds me of a scripture. Okay, we're going to take this screw out. You see there is a little bit of dampness on that because the sealant was also worn out on there, but that's not surprising. So we'll dry that up a little bit before we put our trim rail back on. Get that just nice and cleaned out. For the most part, trim rail's been pretty clean until this end, so but we're gonna grab it here and just keep on going. Alright, we're getting towards the end, so what we're going to do here is going to gauge our length and then going to cut this. Nice straight cut here. Put that back over there. Okay, there we go. It's a lot easier to put in when you don't have to mess with the roll as a note, but you kind of have to deal with that until you get to towards the end, and then you can see it's a little easier to push into the track because we're not fighting the roll at all. So remember, before we do that, we need to check our screw hole. So just going to make a small indentation there just to mark where we're at, so we know where we're going to screw our screw into. Now, sometimes the ends here are the hardest to get in because, well, it's the end. Now just remember, after you put this in, we're going to be not only screwing that in, but filling it in with RTV. So get this screw started here. All right, now we've got our screw in. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our RTV here. I'm going to fill this end in with it. I'm going to really fill it up there. Pack that into that end, because I don't want any water getting in there. But I'm also going to seal this screw head up really good and just get that in so I don't have any water intrusion. And that everybody, is the basics to installing a trim rail cover.